They didn't see a threat, just another black face they could dismiss with a polite smile and a quiet joke shared behind carefully manicured hands. To them, he was nothing more than an inconvenience, in cheap clothes clutching big ideas that couldn't possibly be real. They measured his worth in how easily they could mock him, never wondering why he stayed so calm while they laughed. They didn't know the leverage hidden in silence or the kind of power that waits for the perfect moment to speak. This isn't just a story about one company's downfall. It's about the razor's edge between arrogance and ruin, about how prejudice blinds even the sharpest minds. If you're ready to see how cruel certainty collapses under the weight of truth, hit like, subscribe for more of these unflinching looks at power and justice, and tell me in the comments what you think so far and where you're watching from. Let's talk about what it takes to confront the ugliness we pretend not to see. Ephraim Booker took a final deep breath before pushing open the gleaming glass door, the brushed steel handle biting cold against his fingers even through the sweat forming on his palm. As he entered, every conversation in the long, polished conference room fell silent. 12 people sat around the thick cherrywood table, their tailored suits crisp, hair immaculate, watches flashing gold and silver under the recessed lighting. Ephraim immediately felt out of place in his khakis and plain Oxford shirt that had gone soft at the collar from too many washes. His brown leather shoes were old, the right ones scuffed at the toe, the soles worn. But he forced his back straight, gripping his battered leather notebook like a lifeline. Pages inside filled with careful notes, projections, and hand-drawn charts he'd agonized over for weeks. Richard Holcomb was sprawled in the head seat, a calculated insult, since that seat should have been reserved for Ephraim, the newly appointed interim CEO. Richard didn't bother to move. Instead, he turned, slow and deliberate, to Davis, the director of strategy beside him, and said in a voice designed to carry, "Guess the janitors got big ideas today." The laughter that followed wasn't muted. It was loud, raucous, echoing in the glass-walled room. Ephraim felt heat rush up his neck to his ears, his vision tightening. But he kept his voice even. "Good morning, everyone," he said, setting his notebook at the only empty seat left, the far end of the table. Holcomb raised his brows, a smirk playing at his lips. Ephraim sat carefully, his heart pounding. He clicked his pen open, its metallic snap sounding too loud in the hush. "If I can have your attention, I'd like to walk you through the expansion roadmap I developed," he began, voice low but determined. Holcomb sighed theatrically, leaning back and folding his arms. "Oh, you've got it. Couldn't miss this for the world." Ephraim opened his notebook, flipping to the first page where his plan was carefully mapped out. He'd run the numbers 100 times, stress testing them from every angle. He could feel the sweat trickle down his spine even as he started. "Our current market share is stagnating due to overdependence on a single segment. My proposal is to diversify through—" "Hold up," Richard interrupted, waving a dismissive hand like he was shooing away a child. "You sure you know how to read those numbers? Don't want you to embarrass yourself." Laughter exploded. Ephraim's knuckles went white around the edge of the notebook. He swallowed hard, forcing himself not to look away. "Yes," he said carefully. "I know how to read them. If you'll let me finish." A woman in a sleek black suit snorted. "This is rich," she whispered, loud enough for everyone. Ephraim felt the words like a slap, but pressed on. "I'm recommending that we leverage underutilized capital and secure outside investment. We can realistically secure $6 billion in funding over the next 3 years." Richard clapped sarcastically, cutting him off. $6 billion. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. "Guys, you hearing this? He's got $6 billion lined up in monopoly money." More laughter, meaner now. Davis had to lower his head to hide his grin. Ephraim blinked rapidly, trying to keep his eyes clear. He flipped to a graph with shaky fingers. "These projections are conservative. We can hit them if we adjust production capacity and negotiate distribution in new regions." "Production capacity," Richard mocked in a nasal voice. "You even know what that means, Ephraim? Or did you copy that off Wikipedia last night?" More laughter, one man actually slapping the table. Ephraim's mouth felt bone dry. He reached for his water glass, but his hand trembled enough that water sloshed onto the paper. A couple of people cackled at that, delighted by the stumble. He wiped it away with the cuff of his shirt, which just smeared it worse. He looked up, trying to speak again, but Richard was already waving him off. "Jesus Christ, this is pathetic," Richard said, turning to Davis again. "I thought you said this was a real meeting." Davis shrugged with faux regret. "I guess it's amateur hour." Ephraim felt his heart hammering, so hard he thought he might be sick. He tried one last time. "Please," he rasped. "Just give me 5 minutes to explain the funding structure. It's based on phased acquisition and regional licensing. Weekend licensing." Richard crowed. "Oh man, somebody read Harvard Business Review on the plane." The woman in black chuckled. "Look at him. He's sweating through that cheap shirt." Ephraim glanced down. She was right. There were dark patches under his arms, spreading. He closed his mouth. He heard someone near the door mutter, "Who hired this clown?" and felt the laughter ripple out again. Richard finally slapped the table with a flat palm. "Enough," he said, voice suddenly quiet, deadly serious. "I think we've heard enough bullshit for one day." He turned slowly to Ephraim, his eyes hard, smile gone. "We'll take this under advisement, Booker. Why don't you go get started on the cleaning supplies? They're under the sink in the break room." The laughter that followed was thunderous. Ephraim's head dropped, staring at the water-smeared page. The $6 billion figure he'd circled 3 times in bold looked like a cruel joke now. His chest felt like it was being crushed. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He shut the notebook softly, the sound lost under the laughter. Slowly, mechanically, he stood. The chair squealed against the floor, dragging out the humiliating moment. He tucked the notebook under his arm, fingers gripping so tight they hurt. He turned without another word and walked toward the door. He carried his notebook and an old laptop he'd spent all night updating with revised figures, even more conservative estimates, to preempt the accusations of fantasy. He set up in the small, glass-walled meeting room that senior leadership grudgingly allowed him to use. As the first executive drifted in, he greeted them politely, nodding with forced composure. But no one met his eyes. They dropped their bags heavily on the table, checking phones, sighing theatrically as if they were being forced to attend. When Richard finally entered, late and smirking, he stopped in the doorway and looked Ephraim up and down. "Look at that," he said, voice syrupy with sarcasm. Our fearless leaders got his crayons ready. A few snickered. Ephraim didn't react. He powered up the projector, pulling up the first slide, which displayed the title of his plan in clean, bold font. He swallowed hard and began, "Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you giving me another chance to clarify the funding details, particularly the tiered investment model that would secure $6 billion in phased capital." He clicked to the next slide, a careful chart showing the phased deployment over 3 years. But instead of his neat graph, the screen flickered with an error message. A collective groan went up. "Oh great," muttered someone near the back. "Here we go." Ephraim's heart sank as he frantically clicked, but the slides wouldn't load. "Hold on," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I tested this last night." Richard snorted. "What did you test it on? Your old Sega Genesis?" More laughter. Ephraim's fingers flew over the keyboard, sweat slicking the keys, but the machine froze completely. A slim, bearded IT staffer who'd been ordered to help stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching with clear amusement. "Maybe the files weren't compatible with our system," the IT guy drawled. Richard turned to him and cracked, "Yeah, we don't accept street corner PowerPoints." The room erupted in laughter. Ephraim closed his eyes for half a second, fighting the spike of humiliation. When he opened them again, the IT man shrugged, still grinning, and said, "Sorry, boss. Guess the system couldn't handle all those big ideas." The jab was delivered with exaggerated innocence. Ephraim swallowed hard, pressing his fingers to his temples before lowering them slowly. "I have hard copies," he managed finally, voice ragged at the edges. He opened his notebook and began handing around printed pages, his hands trembling just enough that the pages bent in awkward places. As he moved around the table, people avoided touching his fingers. One woman actually leaned away slightly, expression pinched, as though he might infect her with failure. He forced himself to keep talking. You'll see the funding model is phased to minimize exposure while maximizing ROI. The partner firms have signaled strong interest in, but Richard cut him off with a theatrical yawn. This is worse than last time. At least then we had entertainment value. Someone near the door snickered, and a junior analyst actually put in earbuds, staring at his phone screen. Ephraim pressed on, voice cracking once before he coughed to cover it. He tried to explain the investor incentives, the tax structures he'd modeled, the supplier contracts he'd lined up, but the room buzzed with side conversations. Chairs creaked as people shifted restlessly. A water bottle cracked open with a loud pop that startled Ephraim so badly he lost his place. He heard a murmur near the front. Honestly, it's like watching a high school presentation. His stomach twisted, but he kept reading. Mid-sentence, he noticed one executive, a junior VP named Jenna with a reputation for cruelty disguised as humor, tapping furiously at her laptop. She suddenly sucked in a breath, going pale, and slammed the screen shut with a snap. The motion startled the group. Richard looked at her, amused. Problem. Jenna forced a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Nothing. Just hit send too fast. A second later, everyone's phones buzzed. Richard picked his up. His face twisted into a grin. "Oh my God," he crowed, reading aloud. "Urban hustle nonsense." The laughter was deafening. Jenna covered her mouth with one manicured hand, eyes wide. It was a draft," she stammered. "I didn't mean to." Ephraim felt like the room was spinning. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His pulse thundered in his ears. Richard read it again for those who hadn't heard. Urban hustle nonsense. He wiped a fake tear from his eye. "Jenna, you have a way with words." Someone banged the table with a palm. "Best subject line ever," they crowed. Jenna tried to laugh, voice breaking. "It was a joke draft. I was going to delete it." "Yeah," Richard drawled. "Joke's on us for pretending this was serious." Ephraim's eyes burned. He felt something inside him crack, a deep, dull pain in his ribs, as if something vital had been crushed. He blinked hard to clear his vision and found every face turned to him now, waiting for a reaction. He couldn't give them one, couldn't risk it. He shut his mouth, lips trembling. Richard sighed, feigning disappointment. "Look, Ephraim, this has been something, but we have actual business to get to." He waved a dismissive hand. He couldn't afford to crumble. Not yet. As he walked toward his tiny office, he kept his eyes trained on the dull carpeted floor, heart pounding in time with the squeak of his old shoes. He barely noticed the gleaming black stilettos approaching until it was too late. A steaming cup of designer coffee smashed into his chest with a wet thud, the lid popping off, scalding liquid soaking through his pale Oxford shirt and dripping onto his khakis. Ephraim gasped in pain and shock, stumbling back against the wall. The cup clattered to the floor. He felt heat and humiliation crawl up his neck as the stain spread, turning the fabric a dark, ugly brown. A hush fell over the corridor, only to be broken by the tinkling laugh of Cassandra Fields, the senior marketing VP. She didn't even bother to hide her smirk. "Oh my God, Ephraim," she drawled, eyes wide with mock horror. "I'm so clumsy." "But hey," she flicked her eyes over his stained shirt dismissively. "Not like you were making much of an impression anyway." Her words hit him harder than the coffee. He swallowed back the acid taste in his mouth and tried to dab at the stain with the ripped handout, only smearing it further. Cassandra watched with open amusement. Other staff who had witnessed the scene chuckled quietly, their eyes dancing with cruel glee. No one offered to help. No one said sorry. Ephraim felt a wave of nausea threaten to double him over. He straightened slowly, breath ragged, his soaked shirt clinging to his skin like an accusation. He tried to speak, but Cassandra just stepped around the spill with exaggerated daintiness, leaving him frozen, shaking with shame. As she clicked away down the hall, she turned her head and called over her shoulder in a sing-song voice, "Maybe try the janitor's closet for some paper towels." Laughter bubbled up again from the onlookers, and Ephraim felt the corridor tilt and blur for a moment. He closed his eyes hard. He couldn't lose control here. Not here. Not while they were watching. He forced himself to bend down stiffly, scooping up the ruined cup and lid with trembling fingers. Coffee dripped onto the floor, leaving dark, accusing splatters on the cheap carpet. He tried to blot it with his hand out, but the thin paper shredded instantly, making a worse mess. A few staff members drifted away, shaking their heads in fake sympathy, but he heard the snickering continue down the hall. His heart hammered, lungs straining with the need to scream. He swallowed it all back. He stood, clutching the broken cup and soggy papers, and shuffled toward the nearest trash can, jaw clenched so hard it ached. As he dumped the trash, he felt the heat of the coffee seep down to his waistband, making him shudder. He couldn't go home to change. He couldn't cancel the rest of his day. He had meetings scheduled, plans to fix, reputation to salvage. Though that last bit felt like a sick joke. He wiped his hand on his pants and turned back toward his office, shoulders hunched, hoping the stain would dry before anyone else noticed. But hope was short-lived. As he neared the elevator, he saw Gerald Thompson, a senior manager in charge of investor relations, leaning against the polished chrome doors with a shark-like grin. Gerald had watched the entire coffee incident from a distance and was clearly waiting. Ephraim slowed, hoping Gerald would move or ignore him. But the man pushed off the door and stepped into his path, blocking the button panel with casual malice. Gerald took an Ephraim's soaked shirt and ruined papers with a long, theatrical look. He wrinkled his nose in fake distaste. "Jesus, Ephraim," he said with a smirk. "Having a rough morning? What did you do? Bathe in Starbucks?" Ephraim swallowed, trying to move past him, but Gerald shifted to block him again, voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "Listen," he said, tilting his head like he was offering friendly advice. "I just came from the investor update call. They're laughing at your $6 billion fantasy. You really think you're going to convince anyone to back this company with you at the helm?" Ephraim felt his face tighten, breath catching. He opened his mouth, but Gerald held up a hand, smirk deepening. No, don't even bother. Let me be real clear with you." He leaned in, voice dropping to a low snarl only Ephraim could hear. "They don't trust someone who looks like you handling millions, let alone billions. You're not the face they want. Not now. Not ever." Ephraim recoiled as if he'd been slapped. He felt the heat drain from his face, leaving him clammy and cold. Gerald clapped him on the shoulder with mock camaraderie, fingers digging in just enough to hurt. "Piece of advice? Quit before you make it worse for everyone. Before you embarrass the whole company." He gave Ephraim a final shove, not hard enough to knock him over, but enough to make him stumble back against the elevator doors. Gerald turned on his heel, whistling a tuneless, happy little song as he walked away. He forced himself upright with a slow breath, back straightening by degrees though every muscle protested, and finally stepped out of the elevator onto the floor that housed his tiny office. The hallway was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter from the open-plan workspace beyond. He walked slowly, past glass walls where other managers sat laughing with colleagues, leaning in conspiratorially as they scrolled through their phones. One pair of junior analysts glanced up at him as he passed, then immediately bent their heads together, smothering giggles. He didn't bother to wonder if it was about him anymore. He already knew. He reached his door and paused for a second, fingers tightening on the handle as though it might offer him courage. Then he turned it and stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. The silence of his office was suffocating, empty of even the pretense of welcome. He set down his ruined notebook carefully on the narrow metal desk, staring at it blankly. The pages inside were warped from the coffee spill, smudged ink bleeding across the careful diagrams and notes he had spent weeks perfecting. He forced himself to sit, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, willing the shaking to stop. He had to get control, had to keep going. He was the interim CEO. He had to act like it. Swallowing down the bile in his throat, he turned to his ancient laptop and booted it up, fingers dancing over the keys with practiced familiarity. He needed to update the projections, revise the numbers to reflect the investor skepticism, show them he could adapt. The plan wasn't dead yet, no matter how hard they tried to kill it. But when he pulled up the shared budgeting folder on the company's internal drive, the screen flashed a harsh red error message. Access denied. He blinked in confusion, refreshed the page, tried again, and got the same response. Confused and more than a little alarmed, he clicked over to his email, hoping there was some explanation. The new message at the top made his stomach drop. The subject line was clinical, budget access change. He clicked it open with fingers that felt suddenly heavy. The text was short, cold, unmistakably mocking despite its formal tone. Ephraim, effective immediately. Your access to the internal budget documents has been suspended pending review. Can't have you breaking anything important. Regards, Sean Mulligan, Finance Director. Ephraim read it twice, the meaning sinking in like ice water in his veins. Suspended. For what? For daring to present a plan? For insisting the company needed to change? He felt his pulse pounding in his ears, a mix of anger and fear twisting his gut. He knew Sean had been in the room yesterday, one of the ones who had laughed hardest at Richard's jokes. He knew this was punishment, pure and simple, designed to shut him out, to make sure he couldn't even try to prove himself. He tried to reply, hands trembling on the keyboard, but the words died as quickly as they came. He couldn't beg, not after everything, not with the memory of their laughter still so fresh. He shut the laptop slowly, pressing both palms to the lid until the plastic creaked. He sat in the silence, breathing shallowly, trying not to let the hot sting behind his eyes spill over. He didn't know how long he stayed like that before another email pinged. The sound was sharp, cutting through the heavy air. He flinched before clicking it open. He knew better than to expect one. He forced himself to open his laptop and stare at his plan again, the $6 billion funding roadmap that had become a sick punchline. The slides were still ruined. The hard copies were stained and wrinkled. He tried to revise them anyway, but his hands shook too badly to focus. Numbers blurred. Words lost meaning. Even if he finished it, no one would listen. They'd cut his budget access. They'd cut his authority. Now, they were cutting his reputation. And they weren't finished. That afternoon, the entire company was summoned to the main conference hall for the quarterly all-hands meeting. Attendance was mandatory. Ephraim trudged down the hall, avoiding every eye. A hush fell whenever he passed, only to swell into whispers as he moved on. When he reached the doors, he paused, inhaled once, twice, then pushed them open and walked inside. The room was already packed. Staff filled every seat, from junior analysts clutching coffee cups to senior VPs lounging like royalty in the front row. The lights were bright, washing over the modern stage setup where Richard Holcomb stood confidently at the podium, backlit by the giant projection screen behind him. Richard scanned the room with a king's gaze, soaking in the attention. His eyes lit up when they landed on Ephraim, and a cruel smile tugged at his lips. Ephraim chose a seat near the back, head down, notebook on his knees, though he wasn't sure why he'd brought it. He could feel the stare of people around him, felt them lean in and murmur. He heard someone snicker. He actually showed up, and his stomach turned. Richard cleared his throat into the microphone. The chatter quieted, replaced by an eager hush. Richard began with the usual meaningless corporate platitudes, congratulating teams on hitting revenue targets, welcoming new hires, thanking the staff for their commitment to the company's vision. He was smooth, charismatic, completely at ease. Ephraim watched with detached horror as Richard's gaze flicked to him again, eyes glinting with promise. Then Richard clicked the remote, and a new slide appeared on the giant screen behind him. The words were huge. $6 billion. A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Richard gestured grandly at the slide, then looked down at his notes in exaggerated confusion. $6 billion, he asked, voice dripping with theatrical incredulity. Wait, hold on. $6 billion? Did we win the lottery and nobody told me? Laughter exploded, bouncing off the walls in deafening waves. Ephraim went rigid in his chair, fingers digging so hard into the notebooks cover they left deep dents. He wanted to stand, to shout, to run. He did nothing. Richard flipped to the next slide. It showed a badly photoshopped Monopoly board with fake money scattered everywhere, the company's logo slapped onto the center square. Maybe it's Monopoly money, Richard announced gleefully, voice rising over the howls of laughter. "We're gonna buy boardwalk people." The staff roared, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. Ephraim's vision blurred. His pulse thundered painfully at his temples. His breath came in short, shallow gasps he couldn't control. Richard milked the moment, leaning on the podium as if confiding a secret to the entire room. "Look," he said, voice dropping conspiratorially. "We appreciate ambition. We really do. But maybe let's try realistic numbers next time. Huh? We're not in the business of selling fairy tales." The laughter hit him like physical blows, relentless, merciless. Ephraim stared down at his notebook, the ruined pages swimming in his vision. He could hear his own blood rushing in his ears, drowning out everything but the roar of laughter that was directed solely, entirely at him. Plastered above his own face pasted onto a janitor's uniform, the laughing reactions from his colleagues seared into his memory like a brand. Even when he closed the laptop and buried his head in his hands, there was no peace. The next morning he walked into work with his shoulders hunched, his eyes on the ground, the hallways unnaturally quiet when he passed. Whispers rose behind him like smoke, choking and unavoidable. He didn't have to guess what they were saying. He knew. He could still see the smirks, hear the cruel snickering as they watched him pass with that same battered notebook clutched to his chest. But today he forced himself to keep moving, ignoring the hot prickle of tears in his eyes. He was determined to present his plan to the investors arriving that morning, no matter what they'd done to him in the past few days. He believed in it. He had to. It was all he had left. When he reached his office, he found a printed copy of the revised meeting agenda tucked into his doorframe. He scanned it quickly, heart sinking. His name was missing completely. Richards was there in bold, along with the other senior VPs. He felt his throat close. He flipped through the pages frantically, but there was no mention of his expansion plan, no time slot for him at all. He tried to breathe slowly, but it came out in ragged, uneven gasps. They were cutting him out. He knew it. He had known it for days, but seeing it in print made it real in a way nothing else had. He stuffed the agenda into his bag and walked quickly down the hall, boots thudding dully against the floor. The conference center was already filling with staff, buzzing with forced excitement. Guests in tailored suits held expensive leather portfolios, shaking hands with company executives. Waitstaff moved quietly between the clusters of chatter, offering trays of coffee and mineral water. Ephraim saw Richard at the entrance, all smiles, his perfect hair catching the light like a halo. Richard caught sight of him and immediately smirked. Ephraim squared his shoulders, though they felt like they might break under the strain, and marched forward. He kept his voice steady. "Richard," he said, forcing the words out evenly, "the investors are here to hear my plan. It's what they were told. I'm going in." Richard's smirk widened until it showed teeth. "Oh, Ephraim," he said, voice dripping with false pity. "I don't think that's such a good idea." Ephraim felt his jaw tighten. "It's my plan," he said, a note of anger finally slipping into his voice, no matter how he tried to suppress it. "I spent months on it. They agreed to hear it." Richard snorted softly. "No, see, they agreed to hear our plan, not your little pipe dream. We did you a favor cutting it." Ephraim's chest burned with rage and humiliation. He glanced around at the gathered staff, who were watching with rapt interest, leaning in to catch every word. He lowered his voice. "You don't get to decide that. I'm presenting." Richard raised an eyebrow and snapped his fingers. Ephraim blinked as two uniformed security guards approached from the sides. They were big men, chests broad under their dark company jackets, faces carefully blank. Ephraim felt his heart seize in his chest. "What is this?" he asked, voice cracking. Richard clapped a hand on his shoulder, the grip bruising. He leaned in close enough that Ephraim could smell his cologne, sharp and cold. "This," Richard whispered, "is me protecting our guests from being embarrassed by you." Ephraim tried to pull away, but Richard's fingers dug deeper. He raised his voice for the room. "Gentlemen, would you kindly escort Mr. Booker out? He seems to be a little confused about where he's supposed to be." The words rolled through the gathered staff like thunder. A wave of laughter bubbled up immediately, hushed but unmistakable. Ephraim felt it stab through him. He turned toward the investors at the door, a few of whom had turned to watch, brows raised in surprise. His mouth worked uselessly for a second before he tried to speak. "Please," he managed, voice cracking. "I have the plan. You're here to see it." He deleted it before sending. The next morning he found another email waiting for him. Subject line in bold, unforgiving letters. Mandatory attendance. Investor Summit, 9 a.m. sharp. He read it twice, blinking in confusion. They had just thrown him out of a meeting with investors. Why force him to attend the summit now? But he knew better than to protest. He ironed his best, though still threadbare, shirt, tried to cover the faint brown stain from Cassandra's coffee under his old blue blazer, and left early to make sure he wouldn't be late. The summit was being held in the largest conference space on the top floor, one he had only seen a handful of times, usually from the back, standing unnoticed behind the executives as they glad-handed clients and shook deals into existence. Today the room buzzed with activity. Investors in tailored suits sipped coffee from porcelain cups. Staffers milled about checking tablets and printouts, and a tall, modern backdrop proudly displayed the company's name in sleek metal letters. Ephraim entered quietly, clutching his battered notebook against his side like a shield. He tried to find a seat near the side, hoping he could melt into the background. But Richard's eyes found him instantly. He was holding court near the podium, drink in hand, face wreathed in that same poisonous smile. "Ephraim," he called loudly, drawing every eye in the room. Ephraim froze as conversation stopped and heads turned. His mouth went dry, his tongue heavy. He forced himself to walk forward, shoes scuffing on the polished floor. Richard clapped him on the shoulder in mock camaraderie. "Good you could make it." "Investors were just asking about the team," he said, his tone warm but razor-sharp underneath. Ephraim swallowed, nodding stiffly. "I'm happy to answer questions," he managed to say, voice low and hoarse. Richard turned back to the assembled investors, gesturing grandly with his free hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to one of our hardest workers." He turned to wink at Ephraim, then faced the crowd. "Our operations guy. Keeps the machine running." Real blue-collar approach. A polite ripple of laughter moved through the investors. Ephraim felt the words like a gut punch. Operations guy. Not CEO. Not even interim CEO. Just some faceless, menial worker who kept things running. He tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't move. His jaw clenched so hard he felt a crack. He heard one investor near the front murmur, "Ah, I see," with a kind of patronizing tone reserved for children and staff who fetched coffee. Richard basked in it, moving smoothly into his presentation, clicking through slides that Ephraim himself had made, stripped of the details, flattened into corporate pablum. Every so often Richard would toss a glance over his shoulder at Ephraim, smirking slightly, as if daring him to object. Ephraim's fingers dug into his notebook, so hard he felt the cardboard cover buckle and crack. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stood there, rooted to the spot as Richard turned his life's work into a joke for investors, who nodded along politely, unimpressed but amused. When questions began, Richard fielded them all himself, cutting Ephraim off every time he tried to open his mouth. At one point, an investor turned to Ephraim directly and asked for clarification on a projected ROI figure. Ephraim licked his lips, cleared his throat, but before he could speak, Richard jumped in. "Don't worry, Ted," he said smoothly. "We're reassessing all those ambitious numbers. Trying to keep it real, you know." The investor nodded, relieved. Ephraim felt something in him shatter. The meeting went on like that for over an hour. Richard dancing at the front of the room, painting himself as the reasonable adult reigning in a reckless child. The investors relaxed visibly, comfortable now that someone sensible was in charge. The rage he had swallowed for days twisted and hardened into something new and sharp, something that would not be contained any longer. At 4 a.m, he finally stood, his knees weak, pulled on the same threadbare clothes that had marked him like a scar these last humiliating weeks, and sat at his battered kitchen table with his ancient laptop and the little pile of documents he'd guarded for months. The records of every quietly purchased share, every slowly gathered vote of proxy support, every message and insult he had carefully saved and encrypted. He worked until dawn, every click of the keyboard another promise he made to himself. His breathing steady and low, his eyes cold. By the time the sun rose, he felt something inside him settle. Not peace exactly, but certainty. When he walked into the building just after 8, the lobby felt quiet in that charged way he'd learned to dread, a hush that spoke of mockery about to bloom. He ignored the whispers, the laughter that always followed. Cassandra watched him walk past with her phone in hand, smirk already forming. But this time, he didn't even look at her. He rode the elevator alone, facing his own reflection in the scratched mirror, watching the weariness in his eyes burn away inch by inch. On his floor, Richard was waiting by the door to the executive suite, his arms folded over his expensive suit, grin lazy and cruel. "Here he is," Richard drawled. "The operations guy. You lost, Booker?" Investor clown show's over. Ephraim didn't answer. He walked past him, shoulder brushing deliberately against Richard's as he went, feeling the man stiffen in surprise at the contact. He didn't stop, didn't apologize. In his tiny office, he set his notebook carefully on the desk, opened his laptop, and sent one single email to the entire staff mailing list with a subject line that simply read, "Mandatory all hands, now." The reply pings started almost immediately. Confusion. A few complaints. Richard's angry demand. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Ephraim didn't answer any of them. He just picked up his notebook, walked out into the hallway, and headed for the large conference room at the end of the corridor. It was the same one Richard had thrown him out of 2 days before, the one where he'd been mocked and laughed at like a child performing badly in front of adults who should have protected him. He opened the door, flicked on the lights, and sat at the head of the table without waiting for anyone else to arrive. Within 10 minutes, the room was packed. Staffers lining the walls, confused murmurs filling the air. Richard entered last, flanked by Davis and Cassandra and the senior leadership team, all wearing nearly identical expressions of irritation and amusement. Richard made a show of looking at his watch. "Really," he said, voice rising. "This better be good, Booker. We have work to do." Ephraim watched them all for a long moment, eyes cold. Then he tapped the notebook on the table once and started talking in the same calm, even voice that had cracked with fear and shame only days before. "You're probably wondering why I called this meeting," he began. Murmurs grew louder. Someone near the door snorted. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Enlighten us," he said sarcastically. Ephraim's gaze didn't waver. "I'm here to clear up a few misconceptions," he said, voice steady, "starting with the idea that I answer to any of you." The room went quiet at that, truly quiet, the kind of silence that prickled at the back of the neck. Richard's smirk faded slightly. "Excuse me." Ephraim opened his laptop and turned it toward the giant projection screen behind him. He clicked once. A corporate filing appeared in crystal clarity, a full list of the company's ownership shares. At the very top, highlighted in green, sat one name, Ephraim Booker, the largest single shareholder. The room gasped. Richard's mouth worked, but no words came out. Ephraim's voice didn't rise. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. "For years I've been acquiring shares," he said evenly, quietly, patiently, "because I believed in this company, because I believed in what it could become." He clicked again. Ephraim's fingers rested lightly on the battered notebook he had carried like a shield for days, the leather worn to softness from the way he gripped it so tightly when he was forced to swallow insult after insult. Now he let it lie there between them as he spoke, voice calm, even, but unyielding. "You all know who I am now," he said quietly, letting the words sink in. "No more games. No more pretending." The staff around the table shifted uncomfortably, the chairs creaking as people leaned back or sat forward, not sure what posture would shield them from the weight of this new truth. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to speak. Ephraim tapped the notebook once with a single finger. "I wanted to make this work with you. All of you. I spent years preparing this plan, building the model, lining up the funding. I tried to do it your way. I sat in these meetings and listened while you called me janitor, while you dumped coffee on me, while you sent security to drag me out of my own presentation." His eyes flicked to Richard, who flinched visibly, swallowing hard. "I let you humiliate me because I thought if I just stayed calm, if I kept showing the numbers, you'd see reason. You'd want to grow." Ephraim paused, letting the silence deepen, heavy as lead. Then he spoke more quietly still, so they had to lean forward to hear him. "But you didn't want to grow. You wanted to keep me small." A soft, strangled cough came from someone down the table, but was quickly smothered. Richard cleared his throat loudly, trying to reassert some control, but when Ephraim's eyes cut to him, he shut his mouth with an audible click of teeth. Ephraim took a slow breath, letting it out in a controlled exhale before he spoke again. "So here's what happens next." He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it onto the table with a dull thud that made everyone jump. Papers spilled out, glossy printouts stamped with letterhead no one in the room recognized immediately. "I told you I had $6 billion lined up for expansion," he continued. "You laughed, called it monopoly money. I want to make sure you understand it was real." He flipped the folder open with 2 fingers, revealing signed commitment letters, bank guarantees, formal offers of partnership. Names of the biggest investment firms on the continent stared up at them in sharp black ink. Cassandra's breath caught audibly in her throat. Ephraim didn't bother looking at her. "I lined it up for this company," he said softly. "But last night I called every one of them. I told them the deal was dead." The words hung there like a guillotine in the room. Richard's face flushed an ugly red, mouth working soundlessly. Ephraim's voice stayed even. "Instead, they're taking that $6 billion to one of our biggest competitors," he said. "They'll build the expansion plan with someone who actually wants to grow. Someone who doesn't see partners as jokes, as threats, or as janitors." A strangled sound came from Davis, the director of strategy, who clapped a hand over his mouth too late to hide it. Panic began to ripple through the room in waves. Richard surged halfway out of his chair, hands slamming onto the table. "You can't do that," he spat, voice cracking. "You don't have the authority." Ephraim's gaze cut to him like a scalpel. "I own controlling interest," he said, voice quiet but edged with steel. "That means I can do whatever I want." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Ephraim continued, stacking the papers neatly even as his hands trembled slightly with tightly leashed emotion. "But it's not just the money." He reached into his bag again and pulled out a second set of documents, these bound in a thick, black binder. "You all seem to forget I wasn't just buying company stock. I was buying our suppliers." He let that sink in. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Ephraim flipped the binder open, showing a series of purchase agreements, controlling interests in small companies most of the room had never even bothered to pay attention to. Suppliers of critical components. Vendors who kept the company's assembly lines moving. Richard's face drained of all color. "Starting this morning," Ephraim said, voice dropping to a hush that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room, "those suppliers have stopped accepting your orders. No more raw materials. No more parts. No more shipments. Not until I say otherwise." A gasp rippled through the staff. Cassandra's hand flew to her mouth. Davis looked like he might faint. Richard sank back into his chair, so hard it creaked, eyes wide and glassy. Ephraim set the binder down with deliberate care and let go of it, watching the way the room seemed to vibrate with horror. Ephraim Booker stood in the glass-walled office of his new headquarters, the late afternoon sun pouring over polished floors and clean modern lines that felt nothing like the cramped, stale cubicles he'd escaped from months before. The building hummed with quiet, focused energy as teams worked in open collaborative spaces, their conversations peppered with laughter and ideas freely traded without fear. It was a company built from the ashes of the old one he had left behind, the one he had forced to its knees with a calm voice and an iron will. He had taken the $6 billion of funding that they mocked as fantasy and funneled it into this, a venture built on innovation, on inclusion, on the promise that no one would be mocked for daring to think big. Investors who had once politely turned away now clamored for a seat at the table. The name on the door was his. But today, as he gazed at the view of the city that sprawled beneath him, He wasn't thinking about profit margins or market share. He was thinking about what it meant to hold power after being so long denied it. He was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. His assistant, a young woman who always spoke with respect but never fear, poked her head in. "He's here," she said quietly. Ephraim nodded once. "Send him in." The door opened wider, and Richard Holcomb stepped through. Gone was the expensive suit, the tailored lines, the gold watch flashing under boardroom lights. He wore an off-the-rack blazer that didn't quite fit, his hair longer and unkempt, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and something Ephraim recognized as humility, or at least the early stages of it. Richard's gaze flicked up, met Ephraim's for a second, then dropped to the floor. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, voice husky, raw in a way Ephraim had never heard before. Ephraim didn't respond immediately. He let the silence do its work, filling the space between them until Richard shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Ephraim gestured to the chair across from his desk. Richard sat gingerly, fingers twisting together in his lap. Ephraim studied him without blinking. "Why are you here, Richard?" he asked quietly. Richard swallowed. "I need work," he said simply. The words seemed to pain him. I've tried everywhere. No one will touch me." He paused, voice shaking. "After what happened? After the recordings, the emails. Everyone saw them. The investors pulled out. The board forced me out. No one in the industry will even return my calls now." Ephraim raised one eyebrow. "And you think I will?" Richard flinched at the coldness in his voice, but forced himself to nod. "I don't have any right to ask," he said, voice cracking. "But I'm asking. For anything. I need a chance." The words rang in the quiet office, heavy with all the weight of their shared history. Ephraim leaned back, steepling his fingers. He remembered every insult, every laugh, every time Richard had smirked as he humiliated him in front of the entire company. Every time he had called security to drag him away from investors who had come to hear his plan. But he also remembered the long nights staring at the ceiling, asking himself what he wanted to become if he ever won. He let the silence stretch until Richard's breathing hitched in panic. "I can't promise anything fancy," Richard stammered. "I'll take anything. Anything you want. I can't keep living like this." Ephraim finally spoke. "You wanted to give you a chance," he said, voice level. Richard nodded desperately. "Yes, please." Ephraim sat forward, his voice as cold as a blade. "You destroyed my reputation. You laughed at me while you called me a janitor. You told everyone my ideas were worth monopoly money. You humiliated me in front of staff, investors, the entire industry. And now you want my help." Richard's eyes filled with tears. He didn't wipe them away. "I know," he whispered. "I know. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I see it now. I see it every day. I don't have an excuse." Ephraim let the words hang, watching him squirm. Then he spoke. "I'll give you a chance," he said slowly. Richard's head jerked up in shock. "But on my terms." Richard nodded frantically. "Anything." Ephraim's voice hardened. "You will go on camera. You will record a full public apology, admitting everything. Every racist joke, every attempt to undermine me, every plan you made to sabotage my work. You will not deflect. You will not excuse. You will confess." Richard's face blanched. Ephraim didn't soften. "And you will take the lead in our anti-bias training initiative. You will teach new hires about systemic discrimination, about microaggressions, about how someone who thought they were better than others ended up begging for a job. You will make your humiliation useful." Richard's mouth opened, closed. For a moment, it looked like he would protest. Then his shoulders slumped. He nodded, voice small. "Okay." Ephraim didn't blink. "Say it." Richard swallowed. His voice cracked. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll confess. I'll teach it. Whatever you want." Ephraim leaned back at last, exhaling slowly. He nodded once. "Then you have a job." The relief on Richard's face was immediate, almost pitiful. But Ephraim didn't smile. Instead, he stood and extended his hand across the desk. Richard took it with shaking fingers. Their eyes met for one long, fraught second. Ephraim's gaze was unflinching. "You're going to learn," he said softly. "And you're going to help others learn too. Because that's the only way this ends better than it started." Richard didn't reply except for a tiny nod, unable to form words. Ephraim let go of his hand and turned toward the window, watching the sun dip behind the skyline. He heard Richard stand and leave quietly, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone at last, Ephraim closed his eyes and exhaled, feeling the tightness in his chest ease just a little. He hadn't wanted revenge anymore. He wanted change. And today, for the first time, it felt possible. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful, dramatic narratives about justice, transformation, and the fight against prejudice, please consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss any future installments. I'd love to hear what you thought about this plot. Did the twist surprise you? Which part hit the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and join the conversation. Let's talk about the importance of standing up to injustice and creating stories that inspire real change.